Hi there, and welcome to this special edition of In the Labs with me, Beki
and Todd.
And we've teamed up today to create some Halloween fall-inspired projects. So I've been busy creating some gravestones, headstones, and you can see those in the background here. Fairly simple projects, mostly 2D, 2.5D machining, with the exception of this guy over here where we've got the skull that's actually inlaid into the plywood, and that skull is actually a free piece of clip art that comes with VCarve and Aspire. Each of the gravestones come with a stand as well, so they are able to stand on their own. However, if you wanted to have a go at machining these guys, you don't have to have the stand. You can actually wedge it into your front yard to create that kind of real graveyard effect. And so Todd, what about your pumpkins?
Well, special occasions like Halloween don't come without some nice home decor. So I've come up with some nice three-dimensional pumpkins. These are all really easy to make. There's a pumpkin here and there's a gourd back behind me. And they're fairly easy to make, super fast to cut. I happen to use a very small cutter to cut them out. They turned out really nice. You can paint them orange for Halloween, or you can leave them this kind of shabby chic finish for home decor that you can have around your house, maybe for the whole season. And they were really fun to make, I think.
And they look great.
Oh, thank you for that.
Yeah, I think they all look great.
Yeah, I'm pretty happy with everything here. So let's just hop right into the software and I'll show you how I came up with the design for these pumpkins and the gourd. Before we go too far, full disclosure, I don't make many of these slot together projects. This is normally something that Beki takes care of. She's done a lot of them and she knows all of the ins and outs of these things, all the things that you need to consider. You'll note that my design process is a little bit unorthodox, but in the end, I'm happy with my end result, which is great. But if you want to know how a real pro does this, somebody who's had tons of experience, I would highly suggest that you go and look at some of Rebecca's slot together projects, especially the ones that she did last year, the freestanding giraffe and the rhinoceros. With all that aside, let's go ahead and have a look at how I came up with my pumpkin design. So to start out with, I wanted to be sure that we could cut this project in any of our desktop software offerings. So that kind of limited my size of my job. So to start out with, let's take a look at my job setup. We have a single-sided job, 24 by 24 inches, the envelope for our desktop versions of our software. And then the thickness of my material, I chose a 1/4 inch. That was what I hoped we had kicking around our labs when I started designing this. Of course, we're using inches as our units. We're going to zero off our material surface. When it comes to designing, as you know, I always set my datum to the center, but when it comes to tooling, I move it to the bottom left. The modeling resolution is set to standard, so just go ahead and click OK. Now let's have a look at my layers. So what I did was I started out drawing a very basic outline of a pumpkin, nothing too fancy, drew half, flipped it over, connected the two sides together, and that's what I have here, which is a nice looking pumpkin. I added a stem to it. Everything looks pretty good, but I couldn't figure out my final size until I actually had my candles chosen. I knew the measurements of them. So I popped on to amazon.co.uk and found a set of 3 LED candles, which were a good size. Luckily, in the description, it gave me all the dimensions that I needed, so I could instantly go ahead and draw the 3 candles here, or at least vector representations of them, so I could see how they fit with inside my pumpkin. And that looks great. And then also I added in a bit of a candle base. Now this is the minimum size base that I need in order to be able to have my candles sit on there nicely. There's a little bit of wiggle room on each side. You can see that, so that I can kind of put it on there and there's a little bit of play if I need to, which is perfect. Once I had all that sorted out, I needed to go in and start thinking about what I needed to add to these in order to get the parts that I wanted to. So for instance, I needed to figure out how thick I wanted my spines to be of my pumpkin. I knew I needed to add a little bit of something to the bottom of this stem, so I could go ahead and slot that in the top of my disc connector. That's going to be the top of my pumpkin, and I had a way to kind of make sure it didn't pop out. So let's just go ahead and take a look at my final modifications that I have. So if I hover over top of this layer here and I go down to show only this, you'll see that these are the final modifications that I made to those shapes. My stem, I've added a section to the bottom here, and I also decided to radius the bottom of it, just as a little design feature. But that way, when my handle or my stem sits in the top of my pumpkin, the connector, there's going to be 1/4 inch material here in the middle, and then I've got a 1/4 inch above it and at least a 1/4 inch below it so that I've got room for everything that I need, okay? And then I can move those slots up and down depending on where they fit within inside that space. We also have this. This was used to be orange, but I copied it to this layer and I offset it in 1 inch. So each of my spines is going to be 1 inch long or 1 inch thick. And then we have the candle base here. Now, the candle base is just a copy from the one you saw a minute ago. I needed that for reference so I could figure out how to make my discs to hold this all together. This bottom circle here represents the minimum size I needed for my disc. That's the minimum size that I couldn't have the spines protruding into. Okay, so when I slot these things together, I need those spines to stop up right at the edge of this circle. And I also have one for the top as well. Now, these are 2 different sizes. This one is slightly bigger than this minimum base that I needed. I just wanted a little bit of play, a little bit of wiggle room in case things went sideways on me. And then this one at the top here is big enough so that it doesn't make the stem look too small once it's kind of in the center there. So you can see how I came up with that. Okay. Now, what I need to do now is start to think about how to build my tabs, and that's important. So let's go ahead and take a look down here and make sure we have this layer selected. Now, I know that my material thickness is going to be a 1/4 inch. So let's just go ahead and draw a box that's exactly a 1/4 inch high, okay? And that represents the thickness of my material. It doesn't matter the length right now as long as the thickness is appropriate. Now, if I was going to use this as my slot, my tool would plunge into that, would go down the center, but I would have these radiused ends. These ends would actually be round. They wouldn't be nice and sharp because I'm using a round tool. So how do I make sure I have a nice flat end of this so when I put my spines into my connector, there's a nice snug fit? Well, I'm going to need to go ahead and fillet that. So if I go and take a look at my fillet tool, I have a couple different fillets I can use. I can use a dog bone fillet or a T-bone fillet. My plan was to use a 1/4 inch compression cutter to cut this out with. But in the end, once I went around and looked at my material and also found the cutter, the upcut part of the compression bit on our 1/4 inch compression cutter is a 1/4 inch thick. So what would happen is I wouldn't be any benefit for me to use that bit because I'd only be using the upcut portion of the bit. And so I might get some tear out at the top. I'd have a nice bottom, but the tear out at the top. So what I decided to do was to go ahead and order myself a 1/8 inch compression cutter, which was great, but I didn't feel that you all needed to go out and buy one. So what I've done is I've left this design set up so you can use a standard 1/4 inch end mill to cut these all out with. Having a little bit of tear out on the top or the bottom isn't going to make a big difference once you get it all sanded and finished. It's actually going to add to the look. So I wouldn't worry about that too much. So we're going to use the T-bone fillet, and I'm going to go ahead and use the tool radius of a 1/4 inch tool, and we can just go ahead and put those in there. That way I'm going to get a nice slot here that's going to have a nice flat end. And now what I can do is I can just go ahead and put that where it needs to be here. And then I can decide, now I can offset this circle out to accommodate that slot. And the idea is that the slot in my spine needs to come in there and it needs to butt up against the end of this slot. It might not make a whole lot of sense right now, but this is the end result. So I needed this circle to be at least that big in order to work out. Okay, that way I have a little bit of a lip here and a little bit of lip here. So when I slide this in, I'm going to get a nice tight fit at the bottom here, and that would be perfect. Okay, so that's pretty much, again, a little unorthodox how I figured that out, but in the end, here's what I had when I was all done setting up this particular layer. And here we have it. I've got my spines set up with my slots in here. I've got my connectors with my slots. And if you note, if I grab all of this, I simply go ahead and hold down my Alt key and drag up, you'll see that those line up perfectly like that. You'll see that my spine is going to slot in until it bottoms out here on the slot in my connector, and that the end of that spine will actually be not inside my minimum diameter I need to hold my candle. And so that worked out well, and that's the same for the top. And then I have here, I've added in some slots here, And the distance between these two slots is the 1/4 inch of material. And that way I can use these 2 pins to slide into the slots. And that'll hold the stem in the top of my connector, on the top of my pumpkin. And that way I can lift it up and carry it around if I want to. So that's pretty much, in a nutshell, my design process for this. So let's have a look at the actual file that you're going to get when you download this project. As always, when you open up one of our files, you're going to be presented with this notes section. Make sure that you read and understand this. You look at all the tooling in depth, and you make sure that it's safe and appropriate for your machine, the tools that you're going to be using, and the material you're cutting into. Safety first, super important. I'm just going to click OK. Now, as you'll notice, I started to add some different sheets to this project. It was important, again, because I wanted this to be able to be used on or in our desktop software with people with a 24 by 24 inch envelope on their CNC machine. So you'll see that the pumpkin spines are on a 24 by 23 inch sheet. We've got our connectors on their own sheet, and we have our test part on their own sheet. If you have a bigger CNC machine, you could put these all on the same sheet. Wouldn't be a problem at all because they use the same thickness of material, whereas the stem doesn't. I've decided to use something a little bit thicker, about a 1/2 inch thick. Okay, first thing you need to do with any kind of slot together project is cut a test part. That way you can figure out what the allowance is you need to add into your slots in order to make sure you get a nice snug fit. In this case, my test part that I'm giving to you is actually a pumpkin place card holder. The thing you're going to be looking at is when you cut this, if you look at our toolpaths, you're going to want to look at the test slots toolpath, and you're looking at this allowance right here. Right now I have it set to minus 0.003. That'll make these slots slightly bigger, okay? If you end up having a real tight fit, you're going to make this a bigger number, maybe 0.005 or 0.004. If they're really, really loose, then you might want to actually make that 0.002. One thing I do want to remind you is that any kind of finishing you do to this, whether it's just sanding, things are going to get smaller. If you're going to add paint or stain, things are going to get bigger. So make sure you accommodate for that. Maybe even use the finish that you plan on using for your pumpkin on these test parts to make sure everything fits together once they're all dry. Anyway, something to consider, okay? And this allowance is what you're going to use for any other slots toolpaths that you have coming up, okay? Let's close this down and let's have a look at my spines here. You'll see that these have been nested on here. If you have VCarve Pro, you can have the software do it for you. I did this manually, worked out perfect for me. That way I can make sure everything fit in there nice and tight on this sheet. Maybe a little bit too tight with the nesting. You would get a little bit more play in between each spine, but this worked out well and everything fits on here perfectly. Again, I make sure that you adjust your tooling for these slots to have that extra bit of allowance. And that's pretty much it. You will note that on all of these, I have used the automatic vector selector. Did that because when I was setting up my job, it made sense for me to do that. I had to make a few tweaks, and all I needed to do was just make sure that my spines were on the proper layer, my slots were on the proper layer, and then I could go ahead and just recalculate my tooling. I didn't have to reselect my vectors if I had to change things. It just worked, which is great. If you've never used that before, I highly suggest you take a look at that and give it a shot. Okay, so that's here under the vector selector. Okay, let's close that down. We have the connectors and pegs up here. The one thing I want to point out here is that this slot has been made wide enough to accommodate the thickness of material I use for my stem. And these little pegs here, you can actually make smaller if you want to. They don't need to be this big, and that way they'll push farther through your slots in the stem. It's up to you. It's your preference on how, if whether you want these to be right dead center or whether you don't mind them sticking out or in a bit. And once you cut them once, they don't take a whole lot of material, so you're going to want to just make sure they're right for you, okay? I was happy with mine, and actually yours are a bit thinner than mine were because I felt that some people might want them to actually fit more central. But anyway, just something to think about in the end. And that is pretty much it in a nutshell when it comes to the tooling for this. So let's just go ahead and have a look at this cutting on our CNC machine in the labs. So I didn't mention to you that you're actually going to get a gourd shaped candlelight as well with the pumpkin one you just saw me make. I had cut it out of this sheet earlier, so you can see that I was really quite aware that I had to make best use of this material as I could. Now here I am cutting out the test part for the pumpkin candle holder. It's shaped like a pumpkin, whereas in the one that comes with the gourd looks like a gourd. So you end up having two different name place holders that fit really well together. The tab was on the bottom, that's why it wobbled a little bit. Now I've put in that 1/8 inch compression cutter. I'm cutting out those different slots now. Now the trick about a compression cutter, and you'll notice this in the toolpaths, is that the first plunge is equal to or greater than the upcut portion of your bit. That way you're not going to tear up the top of your material when you plunge in. In this case, I had a little bit extra, so I could plunge in 0.22 of an inch, and I had the extra 0.02 of an inch for the final cut, which worked out really quite nice. I had a nice surface on both. Here I am cutting out the connectors. It's important that I tell you that the connectors in both of these projects are exactly the same. So if you're going to make both, you don't need to worry about trying to remember which set of connectors goes to what. I had to use a chisel to remove my parts, which actually was quite easy. It was way better than trying to use a saw for all of these parts. Here I am putting down the material for the stem for the gourd, or for the pumpkin, excuse me. Looks great. Lots of sanding to do, but that's okay. It was short work in the end. And then I decided to paint the gourd white. So this is me just adding a layer of sealer. It's a thick sort of primer sealer to the gourd to make it look white, which I thought would be kind of nice. And there's the connector there being painted as well. I decided to stain both stems for the pumpkin and the gourd the same color. Now here's me spray painting the pumpkin blue. A strange color to choose, but it does look really quite nice in the end. Now I didn't take into account the thick paint that I was going to be using, so all these parts are really quite tight. A little too tight really in some cases, but it did fit together. Once I got it together, it's not going to come apart. The stem fit in really tight as well. Again, if I was going to recut this one and paint it this way, I might make that allowance a little bit more. There I am testing in the candle. Looks really good. And there we have the finished gourd lamp. And then both of them together. It's a nice pair. And now that I have those finished, let's go ahead and see how Beki's doing in the labs.
Okay, so we're just setting up the material onto our machine bed, and we're actually going to cut the skull inlay first. So when you're working with inlays, it's always good to cut the male portion first hand, so then you can test the fit of your male counterpart with the female on the actual machine bed. So that's why we're cutting the skull first. So here we've just got a roughing pass, and you can see it's just kind of roughed that out. We've got those contours in there, and then it's time to switch over to the tapered bullnose tool, where we're going to do the 3D finish toolpath. Okay, so that's looking pretty good. We've got a lot of detail there. Switch over back to that end mill tool just to do a cutout pass. Got some tabs in there to hold that in place. Okay, so that's looking pretty good. So after removing the tabs, I just sand away all evidence of the tabs being there, and then using a wire brush, just clean away those fuzzies. Then we can move on to the finishing. Okay, so here is the skull painted up. So I used a technique that I actually learned from the 2021 Vectric user group meeting, and that's Steph's session, turning your trash to treasure. and she tells us all about how we can create this stone cement effect just by using black paint, white paint, combining the two together to create various tones of grey, and then by mixing in bicarbonate of soda or baking powder, that gives us that real kind of fizzly cement texture that we're able to see throughout here. So if you want to learn more about that technique, then I'll put a link to that video in the description. So whilst we wait for that to dry, let's go ahead and have a look in the software at the Gravestone file. Okay, so here is the Halloween Gravestones file. So the file itself consists of two sheets. We've got a Gravestones sheet, which is 60 by 48, and the thickness is 0.92. This is going to be plywood. And then we've got the skull that you've just seen machined there on a much smaller scale, just to fit that skull on, and we'll come back to this shortly. So in terms of the actual designs of the gravestones, it's fairly simple vectors to draw up. They just consist of different shapes. Predominantly used the rectangle tool along with the polyline tool to create all of these different shapes. In terms of the actual shapes themselves, I just did a quick Google search just to get some inspiration of different types of headstones that you can quite commonly find in a very old graveyard. And so with each one of these has some details of the person whose gravestone it belongs to. So the first one, very simple here. We've got some text, R.I.P. my remains. Here we've got a little bit of a poem, something more fun for the kids really. Here lies good old Fred, a great big rock fell on his head. And then we've got Doug McGrave, again the dates, followed by R.I.P. So the first one is a kind of arch shape. This is fairly simple. We've just got some text, we've got some cracks in there as well. So if you go to the bitmap layer, you can see I've got some bitmaps. I just went on Google and searched for cracks, or cracks in cement. I can't remember what the term was, but I managed to pull out some images. I thought these would be perfect to trace around using the trace bitmap tool to create the kind of cracked effect, and hopefully working with plywood, that's going to come out really nice. And so that's pretty much that for this one. We've also got a stand that matches this stone, so this one goes into that stand. You don't have to machine the stands, like I said in the intro. You could just have them so that they're kind of dug into the ground, just to give it a bit more of an authentic look. However, if you don't have ground and perhaps you wanted to put these on a driveway or a walkway, then the stands is a perfect solution to have them stand up. And if you are going to use a stand, if you zoom in, you can see I've just got a slot here, which is the same thickness as the material that I'm using, the same width as the overall width of the gravestone to kind of create that slot. And then obviously we've got fillets in there so that our tool can get into those corners. So those fillets are created using the fillet tool here, based upon the radius of the tool that I plan to use to machine this out of. Moving on to the second headstone. Okay, so again, fairly basic. We've just got this space that we're just going to pocket down. We've got the text, copied some of those cracks over into this one. And then here, I've actually took this motif from a Google image that I found of a very old gravestone. I thought that'd been really nice to recreate this in this kind of 2D, 2.5D effect. And so how have I drew up the vectors for that? So if we just switch off the bitmap layer, you can see I've actually got quite a few layers for Gravestone 2. So if we just switch some of those off. So initially I actually just kind of traced around the shapes for from the actual image itself to get the initial shapes, and then using the kind of stacked text effect, we're going to create a stacked object. So we want the skull to be prominent, which is what we've got here. So we're going to be machining between this vector here and this vector here. Following that, we're going to go a stage deeper. We're going to machine between this vector here and this vector here. So it's a combination of the skull with the top portion of those wings. And then once we've machined that, we're going to machine down a further level where we're going to machine between this vector here and this vector here, which again is a combination of the skull, the top wings and the bottom wings. And that's going to give us that layered effect. And then with each of these layers, you'll notice that we've got further vectors which we're going to VCarve onto those specific layers to create the detail, which is where we'll get the detail of the wings along with the details of the face on the skull. And that's pretty much that. Then we move on to the cross. So a simple cross shape which I just drew up using the polyline tool and using the mirror tool to create copies over a line which I drew out in the centre, and that just helps me just draw as little as I can and make use of the mirror tools to create the opposite side as it's going to be symmetrical. Again, we've got some text in here. So in terms of the text for all of these, I used 2 different fonts. So if you go in here, you can see I've used the Onyx font for these texts. For this text, I've got Sitka Banner. So those are the 2 fonts that I used, if you would like to use those. And then I've got a 3D element here. So we've got some 3D clip art. If we go to our clip art tab, in Objects and People, we've got this skull, so it comes free with your VCarve and Aspire software. And we're going to look at creating an inlay, which you've just seen us machine the skull portion. And that's going to sit inside a pocket on this actual cross. Again, we've got some cracks, text, and pretty much everything else is kind of the same as what we've discussed in the other 2 stones. And again, each one of those slots into their own base. Okay, and then over here, if we double click onto the skull sheet, we've got that same skull, that same outline, and we're just going to look at just doing a 3D machine on that, which we've just done, and that's going to slot into the female portion on this gravestone. Okay, so let's switch over to the Toolpaths tab and we'll just quickly go over some of those toolpaths. And so for our skull, we are working in a much smaller setup, so it's 6x6 and the material thickness we're using is 1 inch. So I've just got a 3D roughen toolpath in here using just shy of a 1/4 inch end mill. Everything's fairly standard in here to what we teach in the tutorials. And then the finish, we've got a tapered ball nose, and again, pretty much standard. We're using an offset strategy here. And so let's just visualize what those look like. So we'll just preview the visible toolpaths there. And then to cut that out, as you've just seen that being done, I've used the male inlay. So rather than a profile toolpath, I'm using the inlay toolpath just to ensure that we match that up with the female counterpart on the cross. And so just cutting all the way through using that same end mill. We've got tabs in there, and that's pretty much it. And so if we go ahead and preview that one, and that's what we're left with. So let's just close out here and we're going to switch over to the Gravestones sheet. Okay, so if we just tile our windows so we can see both the 2D and the 3D view. So headstone 1, so you can see I've actually grouped them per headstone. That's purely just in case you just wanted to machine one of them. You can just take the set of toolpaths that I've created for you. Okay, so we've pretty much got a pocket for the main area, so just cutting down 1/4 inch there. We've got VCarve toolpath that's going to start at 1/4 inch because we've already machined away the majority of that pocket, and then we're going to use a 90-degree V-bit to machine the text and the cracks. We've also got a chamfer toolpath here that's going to chamfer the edge of our base. So if we double click and to go into that chamfer toolpath, you can see the settings that we've got there. And so we've got sloping downwards, and that's pretty much that. Got a pocket slot for the base, so that's pocketing down in here. So we're actually using a different end mill for the pocket and the profile cuts because we're going to be using a compression cutter which has both up and downward cutting. As it's plywood, we want to make sure we have a nice cutting face on both sides of those. And so if we just preview all of those toolpaths, so we'll preview the visible toolpaths here. So there's your pocket, there's our V-carve, our chamfer, a pocket for our slot, and then our cutouts, and that's pretty much that. So that's going to look, that should look pretty cool. Okay, so if we just put that in Z and then we'll close out of the preview toolpath, we'll just minimize that and we'll go on to headstone 2. Okay, so we're going to pocket the main area. So again, using the same tool that we used to pocket out the main area here, so we're using a much bulkier tool, just over 1/2 inch. That's going to machine that out in a offset strategy. Then we've got
one level pocket, we've got a second level pocket and a third level pocket. Okay, so with each one we're actually coming down 1/8 of an inch, so we've got 1/8 of an inch from 0, and then starting at 1/8, cutting into 1/8, and then starting at 1/4, cutting down into 1/8 to create that level effect. So let's just take a look at that now. So if we preview the first one, so preview that one, and then we'll preview this one. Okay, so that's that one, and then we'll preview this one like that, and the following one, and you can see we've created that stepped level effect. And then we've got a series of V bits. Okay, so each one, so I've actually merged these all together. It's just more efficient for when I'm actually machining that, rather than it keep going to its home position. And so here we've got a VCarve for the skull, so it's just VCarve in the skull there. And then we've got a VCarve for the top level of the wings there. And then we've got another VCarve for the bottom wings there. And then we've got a VCarve for the actual text along with the cracks. And then again we've got another chamfer for that base. And then again the same, we've got pocket slots for the base along with a profile cutout. And that's Gravestone 2. So then we've got headstone 3, so again let's just undraw that. So we've got pocket main area, again using that same tool, offset strategy, everything's pretty much the same here. We've got the inlay, so here if we go into the inlay toolpath, this time we're using the female, we're using the exact same vector as the vector that we've got for the actual 3D skull. We're starting the depth at 1/4 of an inch because we've already machined down into the cross, and then we're going to apply a cut depth of 1/8 of an inch. We're going to put in a pocket allowance here, quite generous, of -0.02, and that's going to hopefully give us a little bit of wiggle room to pop that skull in. As we've just painted it, we need to give it a little bit of extra thought as to what the allowance will be here. That's why I've gone a bit more generous than I usually do. And so let's just take a look at that. So we'll preview that one, and then we've got our merged V-bit tool. So again we've got VCarve, which is text, and then we've got some VCarve for our cracks, and then we've got another VCarve for the cracks. So what have I done? 2. So the first one, we double click on that, we've got that starting at 0 because it actually goes over the top here. This area is at 0, and then I've just gone in a little bit deeper using the exact same vectors, except now we're going in at 1/4 of an inch, which is what we've already machined away. I've just done that more from a safety point of view, so that the tool isn't just plunging straight into the 1/4 inch. So I've kind of got that merged over. And then we've got the chamfer toolpath as well, so we've got that there, and then the pocket for the base, and then again the profile cutouts. And if we maximise that, it's pretty much what they should look like. Right then, so let's just go back into the labs and then we'll get cutting these. So we're going to start with that chunky tool just to pocket out the main area. That's just going to give us that step down, just to give us a little bit of a 3D look to the gravestone by working with different kind of levels of height. Following that, we're then machining out the inlay for the skull. So this is just a pocket inlay, and then once that was done, I actually tested the fit of our finished skull and it fit perfectly. From there, we switched to the V-bit to then machine the cracks along with the text for that headstone. And the really nice thing about this is that the layers of the plywood come through in all of those areas that use the V-bit, which looks really cool. So that's what it looks like here. So we've got a real nice weathered look there, and I think it really adds to the effect of the actual headstone itself. Then switching to that shy of 1/4 inch tool, just running a cutout pass, and that's cutting out both the headstone and the stand. Okay, so detabbing the stone, we can lift that away from the material, and you can see that looks pretty cool. So then we're going to take some sandpaper and a wire brush, and we're just going to remove some of those fuzzies that we've got there, and then using the sanding machine we're just going to remove all evidence of those tabs. Okay, so to help move things on a little bit more quickly, I've brought in the help of my teammate Ollie, and Ollie is going to paint up Doug McGrath's headstone, and then I can get on machining headstone number 2. So we've already cleared out the main area. Now we're going to look at cutting the top levels to bring that 3D skull with the wings, but using 2D and 2.5D toolpaths. So we're just doing a series of pockets there, and you can see I've made a little bit of a mistake there. I've used the wrong tool. I've got an upcut tool, which you can see it's created all of that tear out where the material's been pulled up. So using the wire brush carefully in the right direction, I'm able to just push that away so it doesn't tear the top level. And moving on to the next set of toolpaths. So we've got the V-bit tool where we're machining the text, we're machining the detail of the skull along with the cracks in the headstone. And that's looking pretty cool. So onto the final 2 toolpaths, the pocket for the stand along with the profile cutouts. We're using the compression cutter here, so that's going to give us a good finish on both the top and the bottom of our material. And there it is, that's looking pretty awesome. So there we have it. So Ollie's done a pretty awesome job painting that headstone up.
Okay, so I really enjoyed machining those projects, designing them, and I think they look fantastic. So this one that we've got here, I love the cement kind of stone effect that we created, and you've seen how that was made earlier. But equally, I love the unfinished look of these 2 stones as well. There's kind of a raw, weathered look, and that's due to the nature of the plywood and this machining into those layers. We don't know what layers we're going to get, and so it does look really weathered in different places, and I think it really gives it that old look, doesn't it?
Yeah. They're wonderful. They did really great job. Yeah, I'm really happy with my pumpkins. My gourd, they came out great. I like this kind of color, that shabby chic kind of thing. I can have these on display all year round, and they turned out really good. So right now, these projects are available for you to download from your V&Co account. So go right over there right now and download them. If you decide to cut them and make them, we'd love to see them. Post them on social, tag us in those posts so we'll see them, or put them in the Vectric forum. We're always looking at that all the time.
Yeah, we'd love to see other people's versions of these projects. So if you like this video, give us a thumbs up, and if you've not yet subscribed to our channel, then please hit that subscribe button to get instant updates on the latest videos that we'll be releasing.
And we'll see you at Christmas.